It's about time I started to look at some of the rumours which circulated during the First World War. The centenary of the start of the war gave me an excuse to learn a little about a poorly taught period of recent history for my own interest, and immediately I began that process I came across stories of mysteries, myths, legends and lies, and because these are topics which cross over into debates with dogmatic religious fundamentalists, and the stories themselves evidence something about the human psyche in times of stress and real or perceived threat, I thought it worth sharing some of them with you. I do hope that you will read further, because I want you to form your own educated opinions, rather than take my word for anything I say, ever. Before I get into some of the stories, I want to try to set the scene, so that I can peel back my modern life and modern preconceptions to try to view life as I might have had I been alive at the outbreak of the First World War. At the start of the war, there was a real threat that the Germans might, if they quickly overran France, as per the modified Schlieffen Plan, have access to the Channel ports and then decide to invade Britain. Now, some of you may not know that Germany only became a unified entity after the crushing of Napoleon III's France by Prussia in 1871. Prussia had exploited the railroad and the then new breech-loading artillery to great effect. The unification of the 25-odd kingdoms, grand duchies, duchies, principalities, Hanseatic cities and territories into a single German entity was signed in France in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1871. The result of the Franco-Prussian War echoed loudly in Britain. The old order in Europe had been swept away by first the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, which saw the end of the Austrian Empire, and then this humiliation of France. Germany, through Prussia, was now the dominant force in mainland Europe, and everyone else was just a little jittery. You all know H.G. Wells' 1898 classic, War of the Worlds. You may not know that it was based, at least that is my contention, on an 1871 book by George Tompkins Chesney. Published in the same year as the Prussian victory over France and subsequent German unification, The Battle of Dorking is a short story set 50 years in the then future, when an aged ex-volunteer is reminiscing over past battles. An unidentified, but very obviously Prussian, invasion of Britain has taken place, and the woefully unprepared home team were overrun by the modern equipment and tactics of the foe. At the end of the book, Britain is left as a heavily taxed vassal state, regulated and controlled by bureaucratic foreign powers, and ruled from the European continent. Thank goodness it was only a story. Imagine if that ever really happened. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds was set in Woking, just 14 miles from Dorking, the site of Chesney's battle. Influenced by the supposed discovery of canals on Mars in 1877, I think Wells turned the Battle of Dorking into an invasion from Mars. He followed his classic in 1908 with The War in the Air. That book is not so great, in my opinion, but it does illustrate again the theme of the old European powers being overrun by the newly modernized Germany, with the emerging world powers of America and Japan also taking center stage. The War in the Air sees the USA attacked by huge fleets of airships and aircraft from both Germany and Asia. This escalates into worldwide destruction from the air and the total collapse of civilization. That book ends with a post-apocalyptic vision of the world. I wonder what the American public would actually have been thinking in 1914 if they were then aware that Germany really had been planning to invade the USA as early as 1897, those plans only becoming public knowledge in 2002. So Chesney's 1871 book was intended to highlight the fact that the once proud British military had been allowed to deteriorate, whilst other countries, the Prussians in particular, had modernized and built up their military base. The book was widely read and went through several reprints, and my 1914 copy shows that it was still resonating with people at the start of the First World War. It was also more than once mentioned in the House of Commons when debates on the readiness of the British armed forces were had. The First World War brought with it new technology. Wireless communication was in its infancy. There would be no radio stations broadcasting until after the war, and television was in the far future. New technology is always grist for the rumour mill, and the fact that the only news people could receive was via a heavy regulated newspaper press, or by word of mouth, is something difficult for us to truly comprehend in an age of 24-hour rolling news and Twitter feeds to our phones. Heavier than air machines were only 10 years old, and the huge Zeppelins only a couple of years older. Aerial bombardment of Britain was a real possibility for the first time ever, and became a reality with the first Zeppelin raids in early 1915. The U-boats and dreadnought battleships were also new to the theatre in World War I. The U-boats threatened like never before the surface fleet with which Britannia had for so long ruled the waves. The effectiveness of that threat was placed beyond doubt following the sinking of 3 Royal Navy cruisers by U-9 on the 22nd of September 1914. The dreadnoughts could deliver a devastating barrage against coastal installations from beyond the horizon. Naval bombardments of Yarmouth, Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby in 1914 brought the fact of bombardments home to the natives. The enemy had been identified, dehumanised and vituperated. Johnny Foreigner was amongst us, and anyone who felt powerless at hearing the dreadful rumours of what was going on across the water could empower themselves, just a little, by reporting any strange goings-on, whether witnessed first or second-hand, or even just heard about down the pub. And if anyone felt the need to avenge the death of a friend or loved one overseas, the neighbour's nanny with the odd accent, or the local bookseller with the Germanic surname, were as good a target as any. Everyone was just doing their civic and patriotic duty, after all. The result of the distrust of aliens, whipped up by headlines in the press, resulted in a general policy of the internment of enemy aliens, males at least. This was done as much for the protection of the foreigners who, having lost their jobs and means of support, and with no way of getting home, now faced the real threat of physical assault by a British public goaded on by the press and looking for scapegoats. The 1915 sinking of the Lusitania, possibly engineered by the British government with a view to bringing the Americans into the war, now there's a conspiracy theory for you to run with, resulted in anti-German rioting. Any shop belonging to a suitable foreign-sounding proprietor became a target for the mob, and the anti-alien sentiment increased. Of course, the government played on this as a tool for their recruitment drive. The dreadful plight of the innocent aliens trapped on British shores and abused and threatened by a public whipped up into a frenzy was a price worth paying to ensure that the fight to defend the great British standards of morality and civilization against the barbarian Hun was successful. Unemployed and now unemployable foreign workers, long-term residents, and those unlucky enough to be the wrong side of the border when the balloon went up, now looked to charitable organisations for assistance. Eventually, internment for protection became a general policy, and the camps grew. Over 20,000 civilians, almost exclusively men, were interned in camps on the Isle of Man. Internment was not new for the British. We had deliberately starved 40,000, possibly many more, South Africans to death in concentration camps during the Boer War in 1900 to 1902. The World War I internees did not initially have a comfortable time, but this was more to do with an utter lack of planning, resources and desire than any intentional abuse. Still, extreme measures were required to defend our country against barbarity, and it is surprising what you can do once you've decided that you are on the right side. The reality was that just 31 German agents were brought to trial during the whole of the First World War. 12 of these were executed, 11 of them by firing squad at the Tower of London. But the spy panic meant that the London Metropolitan Police alone received between 8,000 and 9,000 reports of espionage in the first month of the war. 90 of these reports were considered providing enough evidence to warrant a temporary detention. Next time, I will look at specific stories concerning Zeppelin raids and secret Zeppelin bases, the German planning which had seen pre-war construction work in England, Canada, and even the USA, and the 500,000 ghostly Russian troops which passed through England. Thank you, as always, for watching.